The classroom on Neutral Station Veyros 9 smelled like recycled air and old starlight. With a large room with curved walls and seats arranged in rising rows, and every seat was filled with a student from a different world. There were students with 4 arms, students with blue skin, students with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light, and in the very back row, almost hidden between a Velhari boy with silver hair and a Krethian girl with armored shoulders, sat Sarah Voss. Sarah was 17 years old and human. She had brown skin, dark eyes, and short natural hair that she kept neat under a small clip. She wore the standard gray uniform of the Interstellar Academy, same as everyone else, but on her it looked a little plain. She did not have glowing eyes or extra limbs. She did not have natural armor or telepathic range. She had a notebook, a stylus, and a habit of watching everything very carefully before she spoke. Professor Alun stood at the front of the room. He was a Velhari, tall and pale with long fingers and a calm voice that made even difficult subjects feel manageable. He was teaching galactic history, specifically the 3 great alliance wars that had shaped the current structure of interstellar diplomacy. The students were listening mostly. A few were doodling. Sarah was writing every word. Then the door opened. It was not a polite opening. The door swung wide, and a figure walked in that made the entire room go quiet in one breath. He was enormous, 7 feet tall, 4 arms crossed over a chest, covered in old battle scars, and a face that looked like it had been carved from dark stone. His uniform was covered in medals and rank insignia, and every one of those decorations had been earned on a battlefield. This was General Drakveth of the Krethian High Command, and he walked into that classroom like he owned every room he had ever entered. Professor Alun stepped back without a word. Drakveth looked around the room slowly. His eyes moved from face to face, the way a soldier scans a battlefield, looking for threats, looking for weakness, finding nothing worth worrying about. He walked to the front of the class, and stood there with both of his lower hands behind his back, and both of his upper hands resting on the lecture table. He said he was there to teach them something real. He said Professor Alun's history lessons were fine for context, but that the students in this room needed to understand how the galaxy actually worked. He said power was the only language the universe respected. He said that some species had it, and some species spent their entire existence pretending they did. Then he started talking about humans. He was not cruel about it at first. He was almost scientific. He listed the facts the way someone reads a report. Humans had a lifespan of roughly 80 years, which was short by galactic standards. Humans had no natural armor, no psionic range, no venom, no echolocation, no secondary heart. Humans needed sleep every single night, or they became useless. Humans were, by almost every biological measure, one of the softest and most fragile species that had ever developed space travel. A few students laughed, not loudly, just small sounds, quickly covered. Drakveth continued. He said humans had been part of the galactic community for less than 200 years, which was barely a breath in the long history of the stars. He said human diplomats talked a great deal, but carried very little real weight. He said human military strategy was copied and adapted from other species. He said human culture was interesting, the way a child's drawing was interesting. Earnest, even touching, but not something you would hang in a hall of real art. More laughter now. Actual laughter, though some students kept their faces neutral out of courtesy. Drakveth paused and looked at the room. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he smiled, not a warm smile, but the kind of smile that said he was enjoying himself. And he issued the challenge. He said that if any student in this room believed he was wrong, they were welcome to stand up and say so. He said he had been in 40 years of active service across 9 star systems, and he had never once been proven wrong about an assessment he had made of a species' worth. He said it with the easy confidence of a man who fully expected the room to stay silent. Every student looked at the floor, or at their desk, or at the wall, anywhere but at the general. Except Sarah Voss. She was already looking at him. She had been looking at him since the moment he walked in. She had been watching the way his weight shifted when he spoke, noticing the small hesitation before certain words, clocking the way he never once looked at the back row. She had been taking notes, but not on his words, on him. She raised her hand. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. It was the kind that fills a room like cold water, sudden, total, and impossible to ignore. The Velhari boy beside her turned his head so fast his silver hair swung forward. The Krethian girl on her other side made a low sound in her throat that might have been a warning. Drakveth looked at the back row. He found her hand in the air, small, steady, not shaking at all, and his expression shifted. Not to anger, to something more like curiosity, the way a scientist looks at an unexpected result. He said to go ahead. Sarah did not stand up right away. She set her stylus down first. She closed her notebook. She looked at Drakveth the way she had been trained by her grandmother to look at any problem, straight at the center of it, without flinching and without rushing. Then she stood. She said that with respect, she disagreed with his assessment, and that she would be willing to say so formally if he wanted to make it official. Drakveth stared at her for a long moment. Around the room, students were holding their breath. Professor Alun had gone very still near the back wall, his long fingers pressed together in front of his face. Then Drakveth laughed. It was a real laugh, short and sharp, the kind that does not mean something is funny, so much as it means something is surprising. He looked at Sarah Voss, 17 years old, no armor, no extra arms, no glowing eyes, and he asked her if she understood what she was doing. She said yes. He asked if she understood who he was. She said yes to that too. He leaned forward on the lecture table with two of his hands and looked at her from across the room. He said that in that case, they could make it very official indeed. He said that if she wanted to challenge his assessment, she could do it properly, in front of the whole academy, in 3 rounds, with real stakes. He said if she lost, he would recommend that humans be formally removed from the strategic track program at this academy, on the grounds that the species lacked the fundamental capacity for serious military and diplomatic thought. The room made a sound like all the air had been sucked out of it. And Sarah Voss, standing in the back row with her notebook closed and her stylus set down, said, yes. The main amphitheater of Veyros 9 held 2,000 students when it was full. It was full now. Every seat was taken, and students were standing along the walls 3 deep, leaning over the upper rails, pressed into the doorways. The noise of 2,000 different species trying to whisper at the same time sounded like a low, continuous hum that vibrated in the chest. Sarah walked in from the south entrance, with Jorik 2 steps behind her. She had slept for 4 hours. She had eaten a full breakfast. She looked calm, which some students near the entrance found confusing, because calmness was not what they had expected from someone who was about to face Drakveth in front of the entire academy. Drakveth was already on the floor of the amphitheater, standing at ease, his forearms loose at his sides. He was wearing his full military uniform. He looked at Sarah when she walked in, with the same expression he had given her in the classroom. That flat, evaluating look, that calculated and measured and filed the results away. He said good morning in standard Galactic Common. His voice was easy and relaxed. Sarah said good morning back. The Academy's senior proctor, a tall Velhari woman named Overseer Thene, stood at the center of the floor and explained the rules to the assembled crowd. 3 rounds. The first was tactical simulation. Both participants would face the same battlefield scenario in isolated booths, and their strategies would be scored by an independent algorithmic panel. The second was physical endurance, a sustained challenge designed to test the outer limits of each participant's stamina. The third was open debate on a topic chosen by the challenger, which was General Drakveth. The crowd was quiet as stone. The simulation booths were 2 enclosed stations at opposite ends of the floor. Sarah sat down in her booth and pulled the interface toward her. The scenario loaded on the screen. A supply chain collapse across 3 contested star systems, with hostile forces pressing from 2 directions, and a civilian population caught in the middle. There were limited ships, limited fuel, and no reinforcements coming. The goal was to protect the highest number of civilian lives while maintaining a viable defensive position. A countdown appeared on the screen. She had 90 minutes. Drakveth had won simulations like this before, by moving fast and decisively, taking bold offensive positions to eliminate threats before they could compound. It was a textbook Krethian approach, and it worked most of the time, because most opponents tried to match it or counter it directly. Sarah did not match it or counter it directly. She spent the first 20 minutes doing something that looked, from the outside data log, like losing. She pulled her ships back. She seeded 2 of the 3 contested systems. She let Drakveth's side of the simulation, run in mirror by the same algorithm, press forward aggressively. She absorbed the losses, with small, careful retreats that looked like panic but were not. Each retreat left something behind, a supply node here, a sensor relay there, things that looked like abandoned resources but were actually placed with exact precision. By the 40-minute mark, Drakveth's position in the simulation had expanded enormously and looked very strong. The algorithm tracking both performances had him winning by a significant margin. Then, Sarah moved. It was a tactic so old, it had no modern name in galactic strategy databases. It came from a series of conflicts on a single small planet, fought by groups of soldiers who had no air support, no heavy armor, and no hope of winning in a direct fight. They had won anyway, by doing exactly what Sarah did now, using the enemy's speed and confidence against them, collapsing supply lines from behind, turning abandoned ground into traps, making the winning position into a cage. In 11 moves, she took apart everything Drakveth's simulation had built, not by destroying it from the front, by removing the floor underneath it from 3 different directions at once. The algorithm pinged completion at the 73-minute mark. Sarah had won. The crowd did not erupt. It was too surprised for that. There was a long beat of total silence, and then a wave of sound that was not quite cheering, but was not quite not cheering either. A collective noise that meant the audience had seen something it did not fully understand, but knew was significant. Drakveth emerged from his booth, with his face controlled and unreadable. He looked at the scoreboard. He looked at Sarah. He said nothing. Overseer Thien announced the score and moved the proceedings to round 2. The endurance challenge was simple in design and brutal in execution. Both participants stood on pressure-sensitive platforms and were subjected to a continuous series of physical stresses. Changes in gravity, temperature variation, sustained exertion requirements, balance challenges, and resistance loads that gradually increased over time. The test was designed to push both participants until one of them stepped off the platform. There was no time limit. It ended when someone stopped. Drakveth was expecting to win this round easily. He had good reason to. Krethians were physically exceptional, denser muscle structure, higher pain threshold, and a cardiovascular system that was more efficient than a human's by nearly every measure. In a direct physical contest, he should have been able to outlast a human by hours. What he had not accounted for was that Sarah had spent the last 2 years training for high-altitude distance running on Earth. She had run in thin air, in heat, in cold, with weighted packs on her back. She had learned how to settle into pain the way a person settles into an uncomfortable chair, acknowledging it, adjusting, and then continuing anyway. She knew what her body felt like at its absolute limit, and more importantly, she knew that the limit was rarely where it first appeared to be. The first hour was very hard. The second hour was harder. By the third hour, the temperature had dropped significantly, and the gravity load had increased to a level that made every breath feel like lifting something heavy. Sarah's legs were burning. Her hands were shaking in small, tight tremors. Her vision had narrowed to the platform in front of her, and the single thought she had decided to hold on to. Not yet. She did not look at Drakveth. Looking at Drakveth was not part of the plan. At the 4-hour mark, Drakveth called for a formal pause, within the rules, allowed once per round. He stood straight and breathed for 60 seconds. When he looked across at Sarah, she was still standing, still looking forward, still holding the same thought she had been holding for 4 hours. He restarted the round. She restarted with him. At 5 hours and 40 minutes, Drakveth stepped off the platform. He did not fall. He stepped off cleanly, with full control, and stood straight. He said nothing, but the fact was the fact. He had stepped off first. Overseer Thien ruled it a technical victory for Sarah. Not a full win, because of the pause and various scoring adjustments the rules allowed, but a victory nonetheless. The official ruling was a draw with competitive advantage to Sarah. The crowd was fully alive now. The hum had become something louder. Students were on their feet. Some of them were calling Sarah's name. Others were calling it in their own languages, which meant the sound was a layered, overlapping thing that filled the amphitheater from floor to ceiling. Sarah stepped off the platform on steady legs. Just barely steady, but steady. Jorik was at her side in seconds, with water and a blanket, and the expression of someone who has witnessed something they will describe to others for the rest of their life. She drank the water. She sat down. She had 1 round left. Across the floor, Drakveth stood alone, and looked at her with an expression that was very different from the one he had worn in the classroom. It was not admiration yet. It was not quite respect yet. But it was no longer dismissal. The news moved through Veyros 9 the way fire moves through dry grass, fast and in every direction at once. By the time Sarah walked out of Professor Alun's classroom, students were already gathering in the hallway. Word had reached the upper floors before she even made it to the stairs. A human girl had stood up to General Drakveth. A human girl had said yes to a formal challenge. A human girl had either done something very brave or something very stupid, and nobody was entirely sure which. Sarah walked with her head down and her notebook pressed to her chest. She was not running. She was not shaking. She was thinking. Her classmate Jorik caught up with her at the stairwell. Jorik was a Thulon, stocky and broad, with rust-colored skin and 3 eyes that were all currently very wide. He said her name twice before she looked up. Then he asked her what she was thinking. He said it loud, the way someone says something when they genuinely cannot understand what just happened. She told him she was thinking about Krethian battle records. He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but firmly. He said she needed to understand that Drakveth had not lost a single formal challenge in 37 years. He said the general had defeated military commanders, senior diplomats, and decorated strategists. He said Sarah was a first-year scholarship student, from a species that most of the galaxy considered a novelty. He said the words with real worry in his voice, not cruelty. She looked at him. She thanked him. Then she kept walking. The formal challenge was announced that evening over the Academy's broadcast system. The words were read in 12 languages simultaneously, which was what the Academy did for important events. General Drakveth of the Krethian High Command had issued a gauntlet challenge to student Sarah Voss of Earth. The challenge would take place the following afternoon in the main amphitheater. All students and staff were invited to attend. There would be 3 rounds: tactical simulation, physical endurance, and open debate. The rules were simple and very old. If Sarah lost, Drakveth would formally petition the Academy Board to remove humans from the Strategic Track program. His word carried enough weight that the petition would almost certainly succeed. If Sarah won, Drakveth would publicly retract every word he had said in Professor Alun's classroom. Professor Alun found her in the Academy library, 2 hours after the announcement. She was sitting alone at a table covered in data tablets, each one showing a different piece of Drakveth's military history. Battle logs, tactical reports, psychological profiles from allied intelligence agencies. She had requested everything the library system would release to a first-year student. It was not everything she needed, but it was a start. A loon sat across from her quietly. He was a gentle person by nature, and his voice when he finally spoke was very careful. He said he admired her courage more than he could express. He said he also needed to tell her, as her professor and someone who genuinely cared about her future, that she did not have to do this. He said a formal withdrawal was allowed under Academy rules. He said no one would think less of her. Sarah looked up from a battle log that described a tactical simulation Drakveth had won in 11 minutes against a decorated Krell commander. She asked Alun if he believed what Drakveth said about humans. Alun was quiet for a long time. Then he said no, he did not believe it. He said he thought humans were remarkable in ways that were very difficult to measure on a standard assessment scale. She said then she was going to prove him right. Alun pressed his long fingers together, the same way he had in the classroom. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was equal parts worry and something that looked almost like pride. Then he stood, nodded once, and left her to her work. She worked until the early hours of the morning. She did not stop to eat until Jorek showed up at the library door at midnight with a box of food from the academy canteen, and the kind of look on his face that said he was still terrified, but he was not going anywhere. He sat on the floor beside her chair, and they went through Drakveth's battle records together. Jorek pointed out patterns he recognized from their shared strategy classes. Sarah wrote them down in a list, and then crossed most of them off, because Drakveth would expect her to use the obvious counters. She needed something he would not expect. She needed something so old and so unfamiliar that no Krethian war algorithm would have it in its database. She called her grandmother just before 2 in the morning, station time. The comm lag was significant. Earth was far. But the old woman's face appeared on the screen with the calm brightness it always had, regardless of the hour or the distance. Her grandmother was 73 years old and had spent 30 years as a military historian before she retired to a small house in Lagos with a garden that she tended with the same focused attention she had once given to classified battle analysis. Sarah explained what was happening. All of it. The classroom, Drakveth, the challenge, the stakes. Her grandmother listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a question that Sarah had not expected. She asked Sarah what she already knew. Sarah thought about it. Then she started talking. She talked about asymmetric warfare and the principle of sacrificial positioning. She talked about the human tendency to find solutions in places where the problem had already been given up on. She talked about endurance, not the kind that relies on physical advantage, but the kind that refuses to accept that stopping is an option. Her grandmother listened to all of it. Then she laughed, warm and full, the way she always laughed, like warmth was something she had in unlimited supply. She said that Sarah already knew what to do. She said that, baby, you have always known. After the call ended, Sarah sat still for a long moment. Then she pulled a fresh data tablet toward her and started writing a new list. Not of Drakveth's tactics, of her own. Jorek fell asleep on the library floor sometime around 3. Sarah covered him with her jacket and kept working. By the time the station's lights shifted to morning cycle, she had a plan for each of the 3 rounds. The plans were not perfect. They were not guaranteed, but they were hers, and they were built on things that no one who had studied Drakveth would think to look for. Things that came from a species with a short life and a long memory. A species that kept going not because the odds were good, but because stopping had never really been something humans were comfortable with. She closed her final tablet. She rolled her neck. She looked at Jorek, still asleep on the floor with her jacket pulled up to his chin. She woke him gently and said it was time to get ready. Overseer Thien called for order 3 times before the amphitheater settled enough to continue. The clapping faded slowly, the way a storm fades, gradually losing force but taking time to go fully quiet. Students were still standing in the upper rows. A few were wiping their eyes, which was something that happened with several species when they experienced strong emotion and was not considered embarrassing on Veros 9. Drakveth had not moved from this podium. When the room was quiet enough, Overseer Thene announced that the debate portion of the challenge was complete, and that per the rules of formal gauntlet, the challenger would now have the opportunity to deliver his closing statement before the panel issued its final ruling. Drakveth stood straight. He looked out at the crowd for a moment, 2,000 faces, all watching him, and then he looked at Sarah, who was standing at her podium with her hands folded in front of her, still and patient. He spoke for less than a minute. He said that the formal assessment he had delivered in Professor Aluin's classroom regarding human capacity and value within the galactic community had been incomplete. He said he was retracting it. He used the precise formal language required by Academy rules for an official retraction, which was a specific set of words that carried legal and institutional weight across every governing body that recognized Academy credentials. Then he stopped speaking and stepped back from his podium. The crowd did not explode into noise this time. There was a long, suspended moment, the kind that happens when something important has just finished. And then the noise came. It was bigger than before. It came from every direction and filled every corner of the amphitheater and went on for a long time. Sarah stood at her podium and felt her legs start to shake, not from fear, but from the sudden release of everything she had been holding together for the last 24 hours. Jorek appeared at her side from somewhere and put a steadying hand on her shoulder without saying anything. She was grateful for that. After the official formalities concluded, the students flooded the floor. Many of them wanted to speak to her, to say her name, to touch her arm, to look at her the way people look at something they want to remember. A Thulon student from her strategy class said she had changed the way he thought about simulation tactics. A Velhari student told her that the endurance round was the most impressive physical display she had personally witnessed from any species at the Academy. A young Krethian student, small, probably a first year, came and stood in front of her for a moment without saying anything, and then bowed, which was a Krethian gesture of formal respect that was not given lightly. Sarah thanked each of them. She was exhausted in a way that went past her muscles and into something deeper, but she was present for every word. Jorek finally pulled her free from the crowd and steered her toward a side corridor. She sat down on a bench and tipped her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She could still hear the noise of the amphitheater from here, the crowd breaking into smaller conversations, the slow dissolve of something large into something ordinary. She had almost fallen asleep when she heard footsteps. They were heavy and measured, the footsteps of someone who moved through the world like it was expected to get out of the way. Jorek stood up fast, but Sarah opened her eyes before he could do anything and looked at the corridor entrance. Drakveth stood there, alone, without staff or escort. His full military uniform suddenly looked different in the narrow quiet of the corridor than it had looked on the floor of the amphitheater. Still impressive, still carrying the weight of everything it represented, but somehow more ordinary, more like a person standing in a hallway. Jorek looked at Sarah. She gave him a small nod. He moved a few steps away, close enough to be present, but far enough to give them space. Drakveth did not apologize. Sarah had not expected him to. An apology would have required him to say that he had been wrong from the beginning, and she understood enough about Krethian culture to know that was not how they processed a loss. What they did instead was acknowledge the outcome and adjust accordingly. He told her that in 41 years of active service, he had conducted formal assessments of over 200 species. He said that in all of that time, only a small number of individuals had ever made him revise a concluded assessment mid-evaluation rather than at its end. He said he had never done so for a student before today. He said he was asking her name again, not because he had forgotten it, but because in Krethian formal tradition, asking the name of someone you had underestimated and been defeated by was a way of recording them correctly. It meant their name went into your personal record, not as an adversary, but as an equal. Sarah told him. He repeated it once, quietly. Then he nodded, one slow, deliberate motion, and turned and walked back down the corridor without another word. Sarah watched him go. Jorah came back and sat beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked her how she felt. She thought about it honestly. She said she felt like she needed to sleep for approximately 100 years. He laughed. It was good to hear him laugh after a full day of him looking terrified on her behalf. They sat there together until the sounds from the amphitheater faded fully away. On Earth, in a small house in Lagos, an old woman sat in her garden with a cup of tea and a tablet propped against the arm of her chair. The Academy's public broadcast had been delayed by transmission lag, but it had arrived. She had watched all 3 rounds. She had watched the retraction. She had watched her granddaughters stand at a podium and say true things to a room full of people who needed to hear them. She set down her tea. She looked at the garden, at the things she had grown carefully over years, tended not because it was easy, but because she found it worth doing. Then she smiled the way she always smiled, as though warmth was something she had decided long ago never to run out of. 3 days after the challenge, the Academy's Public Communications Board received a formal message from the Krethian High Command. It was brief and direct, the way Krethian communications always were. It stated that the High Command had reviewed the public record of the challenge on Varos 9 and wished to formally request that a human strategic advisor be assigned to the Joint Galactic Council's Planning Division. The message noted that the request was the first of its kind from the Krethian Command. The Academy Board approved the request within 6 hours. Sarah found out about it 2 days later, when Overseer Thien called her into her office and slid a data tablet across the desk with the communication on it. Sarah read it once, then read it again. Then she set the tablet down and looked at Thien. Thien said it was not a mandatory appointment. She said Sarah was still a first-year student and her education was the priority, and no one was going to pressure her into a council role before she was ready. She said all of that clearly and carefully. Then she said that if Sarah ever decided she was interested, the door would be open. Sarah looked at the tablet one more time. She thought about the classroom and the challenge and Drakveth's face in the hallway corridor, asking her name again as though he wanted to record it correctly. She thought about her grandmother in the garden. She thought about the Krethian first year who had bowed. She told Thien she would think about it. She walked out of the office and down the long corridor and out into the open station promenade, where the artificial light was set to the warm angle it took on in the late afternoon. Jorah was waiting for her on a bench outside, with 2 cups of something hot from the canteen. He handed her one without asking what had happened. She sat down beside him. Around them the station moved and hummed with its usual life. Students from 100 worlds walking past, talking, laughing, existing in the ordinary complicated way that living things existed when they were not being tested. Sarah Voss looked out at all of it and felt, for the first time in several days, something that was not urgency or exhaustion, or the focused, narrow attention of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and a plan. There was a 30-minute break between round 2 and round 3. Sarah used 20 of those minutes lying flat on her back on a bench in the corridor outside the amphitheater, staring at the ceiling and letting her legs recover. Jorah sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. The sounds from inside the amphitheater filtered through the wall. The crowd was loud, restless, alive with the kind of energy that builds when a crowd witnesses something that shifts its expectations. Jorah passed her a second bottle of water. She drank it slowly. At the 25-minute mark she sat up, rolled her shoulders back, and asked him how she looked. He studied her for a moment with all 3 of his eyes. He said she looked like she had just endured 6 hours of physical stress and had not slept enough, and was about to walk back into an amphitheater full of 2,000 people to debate a 40-year veteran of interstellar warfare. She said good, and stood up. The debate floor was the center of the amphitheater, and it had been reconfigured while she rested. 2 standing podiums faced each other, with 20 feet of open space between them. The The crowd had resettled into an attentive quiet, the kind that means everyone is watching, and no one wants to make a sound that might cause them to miss something. Overseer Thien announced the format. Each participant would speak twice, alternating, with the opening statement belonging to the challenger. The topic had been chosen by Drakveth, in accordance with the rules, and it was this: humanity's presence in the galactic community is a liability, not an asset. The crowd stirred at the topic. It was not subtle. Drakveth had chosen it deliberately. It was not just a debate position, it was a continuation of everything he had said in the classroom, placed now in a formal arena where his rhetorical experience and historical knowledge would, in theory, give him a commanding advantage. Drakveth stood at his podium and spoke for 10 minutes. He was, it had to be said, very good. His voice was deep and controlled, and he moved through his argument the way a commander moves through well-mapped territory, with total confidence and zero wasted steps. He cited the historical record. He cited human biological limitations, the brevity of human involvement in galactic politics, the number of crises that had required larger species to intervene on humanity's behalf. He cited statistics. He cited specific events. He built the argument brick by brick until it sat in the center of the amphitheater like a solid wall. When he finished, the room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Then Sarah stepped to her podium. She did not open a data tablet. She had decided the night before not to use notes. Notes would make her look like a student reciting a memorized answer. What she needed to do was something different. She needed to talk the way her grandmother talked, the way her mother talked, the way humans talked when they were saying something they meant all the way down to the bone. She said she was not going to argue that humans were the strongest species in the galaxy. She said that would be a lie, and she did not have time for lies. She said she was also not going to argue that humans were the fastest, or the most powerful, or the most ancient. She said Drakveth was right about the numbers, all of them. She said she accepted the entire biological comparison he had made, every single point, and she was going to set it aside because it was beside the point. She said the question was not whether humans were the best at any individual thing. The question was what the galactic community was actually missing, and whether humans provided it. She talked about creativity. She said that creativity, the real kind, the kind that looks at an impossible problem and finds a path no one modeled, came most reliably from limitation. She said that every species in the galaxy that had lived long, easy, powerful lives had built brilliant things, and she respected all of them. But she said that the species that had been forced to solve problems with inadequate tools and short timelines had developed something that was very difficult to copy: the habit of refusing to accept that there was no answer. She said humans had a word for it: stubbornness, and that most of the galaxy used it as an insult. She said she wanted everyone in this room to think about what it actually meant. It meant that when the option of giving up appeared, humans looked at it and kept walking. She talked about empathy. She said that mortality, the short, fragile, unrepeatable life that Drakveth had listed as a weakness, did something to a species. It made them pay attention. It made them understand loss in a way that longer-lived species sometimes forgot. She said that understanding loss was what made humans, of all the species she had met at this academy, the most likely to try to prevent it in someone else. She cited the Helian Accord, a diplomatic agreement that had prevented a war between two species that had been enemies for centuries. The accord had been drafted by a human envoy who had sat in a room with representatives of both sides for 19 consecutive days without sleeping properly, refusing to leave until a framework existed. No one else had been willing to stay that long. The human had stayed because giving up had felt worse than the exhaustion. She cited the Marin Plague response, a medical crisis that had spread through 4 star systems and had been contained because a human researcher had refused to accept the consensus timeline for developing a cure, and had worked backward from a seemingly impossible deadline, finding a path that everyone else had assessed as closed. The cure had arrived in time. The researcher had collapsed from exhaustion 3 hours after delivering the final formula. She said she could cite 40 more examples. She said she would not, because she thought the point was already sitting in the room with them. Then she looked directly at Drakveth. She said he had called humans irrelevant. She said he had done so in a classroom, to a group of young students without warning, in front of peers from a dozen other species, in a setting designed specifically to make disagreement feel impossible. She said she wanted to ask him something honest. If humans were truly as irrelevant as he believed, why had he flown across the galaxy to issue a formal challenge to a 17-year-old girl in a classroom? She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said that she thought the answer was that on some level, even Drakveth understood that humans were not irrelevant. She said she thought he had walked into that classroom and seen a species that had not yet been put in its place and that had bothered him. She said that being bothersome, being the species that keeps showing up, keeps asking questions, keeps refusing to accept the answer no, was not a liability. She said it was perhaps the most useful thing in the galaxy. Then she stepped back from the podium and stood with her hands at her sides and waited. The room was completely silent. Drakveth stood at his podium for a long moment. He had prepared a rebuttal. It was a good one. He had spent years sharpening his arguments, and he knew exactly what to say in response to almost anything. But the rebuttal he had prepared was for an argument about power and status and biological capacity, and that was not what Sarah had given him. She had not argued that humans were strong. She had argued that the galaxy needed what humans were. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at her across the 20 feet of open floor between them. One student in the upper rows began to clap, then another. Then the clapping spread in a wave that moved through the amphitheater from top to bottom. From the students who had laughed in the classroom to the students who had never met a human before today, until the sound was everywhere, and there was no quiet left in the room at all.